Welcome back to the Information Security Forum podcast. I'm here with Steve Durbin, Managing Director, to have a conversation about how to protect your critical information assets before it's too late. The terms critical asset management and protecting the crown jewels seem to have been around for quite some time, but until GDPR came into focus, I don't believe that many organizations understood what this meant and what exactly it was they were supposed to be protecting. With critical assets representing 80% of an organization's total value, I guess this is sort of an important topic for businesses and one that they need to address sooner rather than later if they're going to have a greater chance of reducing breach impact and meeting legislative requirements. So, Steve, by definition, what could an organization's critical assets be? And what are some of the threats to these assets?
Well, a critical information asset is really defined by the organization itself. For people, for instance, who are in the manufacturing space, if you happen to be making, ketchup, and you make the red stuff, then your recipe clearly is a critical asset. You don't want your competition to get hold of that. I think we could all relate to that. But if you happen to be, say, a smartphone manufacturer and your marketing plan for the launch of a new phone is something that your competitors would love to get hold of, that for the period up to the launch is also a critical asset. So what I'm saying here is that critical assets can be defined as those that have a long-term impact on a business upon which perhaps a business is founded, but they can also be transitional. So they can also come into being critical, and then once a time date has passed or whatever it might be, they stop being as critical, and so you don't need to worry about them as much. From an organizational standpoint, therein lies the challenge. How do you identify some of these things? Who should be identifying them? And my answer to that is that it always has to be a business decision. The business has to determine the impact of a particular asset to the way in which it's strategically moving. So what would the impact be, for instance, if your marketing plans were suddenly hacked or stolen? What would the impact be on the launch of your new phone? What would the impact be on your stock price? What would the impact be on customer trust? All of those sorts of things need to come into account. And so the onus for me is very much on the business to determine those elements, and then to work collaboratively with the cybersecurity guys to figure out how those assets can be protected. And so we do walk our members through a fairly well-documented process that says, it is about understanding how to identify the asset. It is about understanding where it lives. It is about understanding how you can protect it against what we term adversarial threats. So these are threats that come perhaps from the outside, people who want to get hold of those assets, who might want to steal them, or maybe not even that. Maybe just change the recipe slightly so that the taste isn't quite what you expected.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about some recent examples of critical asset attacks. Maybe you can tell me what you think might have been done to prevent them. We know that there has been a breach at NHS, at Equifax, at Deloitte. What could have stopped these from happening?
Yeah, and that really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Mm-hmm. How do you prevent breaches happening? And the answer is you can't. You can never stop a breach happening. Why do I say that? Well, the bad guys need to get lucky once. The good guys need to be playing a defensive game all the time. And so, we will continue to see breaches. So at the ISF, we talk about resilience. We talk about the ability to respond to a breach. And I think that's where organizations need to get better. I'll give you a personal example. I come to the United States very, very regularly, as you know, pretty much in the US every month, and tend to stay in similar hotels. And certainly earlier in the year, I stayed in a new hotel for me on 2 occasions. And not so long ago, in September, I received a letter from them telling me that my personal data had been compromised as part of a breach that had taken place on the Sabre system. So I had used the Sabre system unknowingly to book my hotel. So here we have a good example, I think, of how difficult this whole area is. So as an end user, as a customer, I go into a system to make a booking. I'm unaware that it's a Sabre system. For me, it's the hotel that I'm booking it through. So the hotel has handed over responsibility for the management of my information to a third party. that third party suffers a loss of data. So the hotel is now dependent upon the third party to inform them of that, so that they in turn can inform me as the customer. My perception isn't that the third party has done anything wrong, it's the hotel, because that is my interface. I am the customer
That's your
of
relationship.
That's my relationship, exactly. And so I tend to become very critical then of the way in which the hotel handles that particular breach, that particular problem. And that's the essence of the issue when it comes down to how do we manage different information assets. And it really brings alive, I think, the fact that we are so interconnected that we may not have control over our third party. We're so dependent upon the third party providing us with information. So, and this takes us back into that whole GDPR world. Under the terms of GDPR, you will have to notify a supervisory authority within 72 hours of a breach. You also have to notify an individual where that breach is significant. Well, in the case that we're talking about here, the data that was stolen referred to name, address, social security, credit card, with all of the associated credit card information on that. So that is significant under GDPR. And you have to do that within a timely fashion. I received notification in September of a problem that actually had occurred between August and March that the hotel was made aware of in, I think, a May-June timeframe. So if we then unpick all of that, that's a challenge from an organizational standpoint. So where is the level of responsiveness in all of that? Where is the customer management? Where is the importance of trust? And so when we talk about the role of cybersecurity, it is about how we, I think, as businesses, can be better equipped to respond to a number of different eventualities in a timely fashion, in a consistent fashion, but more importantly, in a fashion that the end customer finds acceptable. GDPR sets out some of those guidelines, but the onus has to be on the organization providing the service to make sure that its third-party providers are also behaving appropriately, and that it has the response mechanism in place to be able to convey appropriate responses to the customer. Because customer trust is really what we're talking about in this particular instance. And that's where smarter organizations have determined that cybersecurity is a business differentiator, not in the area perhaps of preventing breach, although a focus on the basics, making sure that your firewalls are up to date and software and so on, of course is important, but it's also about how you respond to that breach.
Well, that appropriate response does come down to a timely response. So getting out ahead of communication, sharing what has happened with your customer builds trust, not delaying for so long. That's a terrible way to, that's a total breach of trust in itself.
Just to finish off that little story, it did get worse because the letter that I got from the hotel did tell me that if I had any concerns that I could always sign up with Equifax.
I'm sorry to laugh,
but again, this
ironic, yeah.
It is ironic. But again, it just emphasizes the importance of the way in which you need to work with your third parties so that everybody is understanding what's going on. But there you go.
Well, let's get back to GDPR. In my introduction, I referred to GDPR. How are organizations going to need to protect their mission-critical information assets in order to comply with that GDPR legislation? And is that protection going to be more important to certain industry sectors?
I think that GDPR is very clear in terms of the requirements for the management and protection of personal information. Now, the regulators around the world certainly are under no illusions. They don't imagine that GDPR is going to prevent breaches. What they are hoping, certainly across the European Union, which was one of the driving forces behind the regulation, what they are hoping is that they will bring in a level of consistency that says, as an EU citizen, you have a level of protection around your data. You own your data. You have a right to know who is accessing it, who is using it, how they are protecting it, what it's being used for at every different stage in the information lifecycle, and you can request that information. You have to opt in to receiving things like marketing emails and so on. And perhaps more importantly, what the regulator has done is said, we're going to give some real teeth to this piece of legislation. And it isn't just about, 4% of global annual revenue. There are other things that the regulator is able to do. It is able to stop you processing data, for instance, if you do not have the most appropriate controls in place in line with the regulation. Now, for a lot of organizations, for me anyway, that's probably much more significant than a fine because it actually stops your business. And so I think that there are, things within the GDPR that allow certainly regulators to demonstrate that they're not messing about in this particular space. But it also sets out some very clear ways in which it expects organizations to collect and store personal information in a responsible fashion. And so again, from an ISF standpoint, what we've been doing is really working with our global membership to try to make sure that we're producing the right tools and approaches that they can use that allow them to both identify the information, but to make sure, more importantly perhaps, that it is protected. And so the most recent in a trilogy that we've produced is the implementation guide, which really walks people through the different steps that they need to take in order to identify personal information, to put in place the most appropriate levels of control, and to ensure that they have the right response mechanisms in place. As I've said many times before, GDPR is not a legal issue. It's not a technology issue. It's a cultural issue. It's a business issue. And I think that certainly if you look at the way in which we've come at it with our members, we've tried really to stay true to that and to provide an approach that allows them to provide a very much more holistic level of protection, I think, over personally identifiable information.
You said the bad guys need to get lucky once. The good guys need to be communicative, forward-thinking, have a cohesive cultural message and training every day, all day. It's a big shift.
It's a huge shift. And some would say it's a lot easier to be a bad guy. Until you get caught, of course. But yeah, it's a big job.
Well, thank you for providing a comprehensive definition of what mission-critical information is and the importance of mission-critical information to the business, as well as how GDPR legislation has brought this into focus. We've established how attractive an organization's critical assets can be to cybercriminals, to those bad guys, and how businesses are exposed to adversarial threats. For sure, organizations need to act now to identify their assets and ensure they receive balanced and comprehensive protection. To find out how your organization can establish a mission-critical information protection process that has been developed and used by many of the Fortune and Forbes companies, please visit securityforum.org. Thanks again, Steve.